Today we're going to talk about the second dimension that we're going through in our series of the D, the I, the S, and the C. In depth, we're going to talk about the high I, the I trait, or influencer, if you will. High I's generally are people who are very much people-oriented. As we talked about the highs and the lows and their characteristics of the I, today we're going to give you more in-depth, if you will, about traits and characteristics so that you can recognize them. Of the four dimensions, the I is probably the easiest to recognize. Why? Because they're very much verbal and they're out there and you can see their traits very easily. So they're not hard to identify. So, but let's take a look at, in depth, some of the traits that they have and some of the characteristics and descriptors that high I's have. Again, on your handout, if you want to print your handout and follow along and fill in the blanks, you will have some of these things to refer back to later. And even in some of the other chapters that we're going to talk about, we're going to reinforce some of these things and give you some other handouts that have some of these traits and characteristics on it also. So let's take a look at the high I. We call them influencers. What are some descriptors then of high I people? People who are very much people-oriented. They're very outgoing. We would call them gregarious people. One of the things that's their characteristics, they're very persuasive. High I's generally emphasize their point and use a lot of persuasion in getting people to come to their point of view. They use a lot of words. You notice in meetings and situations where you're having a group together to come to a conclusion or develop a strategy, the high I's are generally the ones that are doing the talking. They'll talk and talk and talk about a point, sometime to the consternation of the other styles. But they're the ones that have a lot to say about it. So they use a lot of persuasion. You'll find that a lot of careers, if you will, are positions that require a lot of interaction of people, such as sales or customer service, those areas where there's a lot of people contact. Jobs like that attract people who are high I's. So we'll talk a little more about that. So they're very persuasive. Another one is that they're very trusting. High I's are trusting. What I mean by that is they're people-oriented, as we've talked about, but one of the things they do when an I is working with another person, how you start that relationship. So let's say there's two people who don't know each other. They've started working together. One of them is a high I, the other one may be a high S or a high C. They start out that relationship. The high I starts that relationship with the attitude that they trust the other person. In other words, the other person is honest, they're open, they're what they say they're going to do, they're going to do. They start that relationship, if you will, in a trusting manner. Only later, if the person that they're working with or the team or the organization that they're working with begins to prove untrustworthy, do they withdraw that trust. Now, the other styles are not necessarily like that. Several of the other styles start the other way. They start the relationship with, I'm not sure I trust you, but as I get to know you, you can prove yourself to me and then I will trust you. You see the difference? The high I's start out with a trusting. As a result of that, sometimes people who are in leadership positions that have a high I style get taken advantage of by their staff or by others because they start out by trusting them too much. Can you do too much trust? Sure you can. But they get taken advantage of. So sometimes they turn cynical. So if you're a high I style, one of the things you want to be careful of is that it's good to trust people, but you don't want to do it too far. Go ahead and put that trust out there, but let them prove themselves also. Another one is that they're very charming. High I's are very charming. They get along well with people. They're good to have in your parties. If you're going to have a party, you want to invite a bunch of high I's. Why? Because they're very social. They get along well with other people. They interact well. Another trait would be that they are optimistic. High I's are optimistic. One of their traits is that they have a lot of self-confidence in general, that they believe that they can do anything, and that time restraints are not a big deal for high I's. They believe that they can come through at the last moment and get it done. I was working with an organization one time that in the sales area. We were doing some sales training and working with them in their sales and marketing. And I was working with the sales manager, and he said to me, he said, one of the things about my salespeople is that I'm having a problem with them exaggerating their numbers. And I said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, when they set goals, and when we set goals for sales, 9 times out of 10, they'll set a goal that's way too high. In other words, they won't reach their goal. So I have to be careful when I report our numbers and our expectations to our production department that I don't use their estimates. I have to cut their estimates back so that we don't overproduce our product based on what they think they can sell. High eyes have a tendency to do that. They overestimate their abilities. I was talking to a professor one time, and we were talking about the difference in style, and he was talking about students, and he said, I can see that trait. You know, I'll assign a paper to be done, a research paper, and give the students a deadline for that paper to be done, and I'll check on them periodically. You know, so if they've got 6 weeks to do it, I'll check on them at the end of the 3rd week and say, well, how are you doing on your paper, and everybody doing well, and then I'll keep. Well, what happens, he said, I'll have certain students, and now I know that it's these high I students, is that their answer all the time is, great, we're doing great, we're on track. Well, come to find out they hadn't even started it yet. They generally start it 2 or 3 days before the end of the deadline. So, but they're so optimistic they can get it done, it's no problem for them. So be careful if you're a high I person that you don't over-optimize yourself, if you will. Another one is enthusiastic. High I's are very enthusiastic. That's one of the traits that we like to have when we have an organization and jobs where we interact with people or interact with our customers or our suppliers. It's good to have somebody that has some enthusiasm. Enthusiasm, you've heard, is contagious, and it is. People who are high I's generally reflect a lot of enthusiasm. People generally get along well with them. Now, if you take it to an extreme, just like we talked about in a couple of the other chapters, if you take it to extreme, it can become a liability. If you're too enthusiastic, then people think that you're phony. So you have to be careful. But high I's generally have that enthusiasm, and we need that. Just as we talk about each of the styles, the D, the I, the S, and the C, people who are high in each of those areas, we need their traits and characteristics. Why? Because they're diverse, and we need that diversity to make a solid team. Let's take a look at some people. Maybe that you'll recognize that these are high I people. You can see some of the traits that we've talked about here in these people. One of them would be former President Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton, we would call him a charmer. He had a lot of charisma. He was a very high I person, knowing that when he talked or when he did his television presidential presentations, if you will, or follow up on national situations on TV, you wanted to believe what he had to say. He was very enthusiastic. He said things with conviction and had a lot of confidence in the way he presented them. Another one that you might like that would recognize as a high I person would be Oprah Winfrey. Very high I person, very engaging, if you will. Does so well on her TV shows and interaction with people because one of the traits that she has is a very high I style and personality, if you will, behavior. Another one that you would recognize in the movie business, if you will, or in Hollywood, if you will, is Steve Martin. And he plays a lot of high I roles in his movies and so forth and so on. He is a very high I person. He's very outgoing, he's very gregarious. Sometimes you can take that to an extent too far and kind of get silly. But he is a very high I person. So we need the high I trait in our organizations, especially in jobs and positions and situations where there's a lot of dealing with other people and interaction with people in terms of our staff or our customers or our client base. So let's take a look at some of the traits also that high I's have. What energizes a high I person? What kind of turns them on? What charges their battery? If you look at this point C down there, it says they are energized by interaction with people. One of the things that high I's don't like to do is they don't like to be by themselves in general. They're built to interact and work with other people, so they don't like to be alone. I found several high I's have told me, they said, well, yeah, boy, that's really right. I said, in fact, I don't even like to eat by myself. You know, if it comes lunchtime or whatever it is in our company and I can't get anybody to go eat with me, I generally stay and work at my desk. You know, and I thought, that's interesting, isn't it? You know, it's not so much the eating, it's the socializing at the meal that the high I's like. So, interesting trait and characteristic there. Another one would be they're highly verbal. So it's easy to recognize high I people. you're in a group, you're in a team meeting or whatever it is, those people who are talking, asking questions, and interacting the most, a lot of times they have a very high I trait. So high I's are pretty easy to recognize in groups. They like working with people, obviously, we talked about that. They're very persuasive in the way they approach, and they also like opportunities for creativity. High I's sometimes don't like routine. They like variety, so they like to do things that are different. So it's important to engaging in high I people is to be sure that they have a lot of different types of activity to do. They're not too good on routine types of things. So as you look at yourself or you look at other people, it's pretty easy to describe or define, if you will, recognize high I people. Let's look at the next one, awareness of potential improvements. What are some of the, if you will, some of the areas that might be some liabilities to high I's? One of them might be is because they are people and they're sensitive to people, they do not like conflict. High I's do not like conflict. They avoid conflict. I've worked with several organizations where several of their managers and in their leadership positions had traits of being a high I, which is very good in terms of interaction with their people. But on the other hand, they were very poor at the discipline side. They would let people get away with too many things that they shouldn't have done, because they didn't want to confront people. They're not confronters. They're so relational. They're afraid that in confronting people, they would damage that relationship. Therefore, they don't. And in a managing situation, it can be very detrimental. So what happens in that situation is, since they don't confront people, the problem continues to exist. The rest of the staff continues to figure out, well, they're not going to do anything about that. So it spirals in a downward circle, if you will, of a lack of productivity and sometimes lack of respect. So if you're a high I person in a management position, be careful. Relationship building is very good and you're very good at that, but be careful that you don't follow up and do the discipline that's necessary, which means that you have to face sometimes conflict. We talked about are very optimistic, and we use that example of the students. Another one might be that sometimes they're very disorganized. High I's are so people-oriented that they're not so much task-oriented. And so when trying to do a job that has some details to it, if you will, they would rather talk with other people. They would rather brainstorm. They would rather do things other than the detailed part of their particular job. So I found that in some organizations we worked with where we had a manager that was a high I person who did not do well at the detail, rather than try to teach that person how to do all those details, we would take a look at those particular tasks that they were required to do and find out, well, which task could be done by someone else. And so we would bring somebody else in to help them as an assistant to do some of those details that could be done by someone else, and free the eye up from those details type of situation and give it to some of the other styles, if you will, or people who were very good at that, some administrative type of styles, sometimes the S's and the C's. So it's good to know, as you understand the different traits and characteristics, how to complement one style with another, and then how to also communicate with that particular style. We're talking about in the bottom part, how do you communicate with a high I? High I's love to communicate, so you're not going to have a problem with being verbal with high I's. The challenge is you may take up too much time. They run up on rabbit trails. They go down, talk about everything except maybe what you need to be talking about in terms of sticking to business. So it can be an irritant to some of the styles, as we talked about in the previous chapter, high D's, which are direct and to the point. High I's tend to run around the bush. They're more indirect communicators. They don't get right to the point. They kind of go around the bush to get to the point. So be careful. They have to be very careful in that area of communication. They don't over-communicate or get off topic. Another one is that high I's like to have fun, and which is great, but sometimes you have to hold their feet to the fire to get the job done. One other one is they're not very good generally in time management. Because they like to spend their time working with people, they don't spend enough time on the task. So they miss deadlines. They, in terms of having a lot of high I's in the sales position, One of the things that you'll hear, and I hear all the time when I work with salespeople and the sales manager, is the fact that they don't do their paperwork. They hate paperwork. You know why? Because it's a detail. They'd rather be talking to the customer or talking to the client or whatever it is. They don't do well on the detail. And they also don't manage their time well. They'll get involved in a discussion or a dialogue with another person, and they forget what time it is. I have a little tendency on that on my side. My wife puts up with me sometimes. I've gotten involved in a conversation or at a work situation or with a client, and I get home about an hour after I'm supposed to for dinner. And my wife has been very patient with me. But it's a trait that happens to high I's. It's easy to lose track of time if you're a high I. So be careful about that situation. Okay, let's take a look down at the bottom. We're talking about stress relief. You know, all of us have stressors and things that cause us stress in our organizations. And how do you get rid of that? And how do you kind of deflect that stress and kind of wind down, if you will? One of the things that's interesting about high I's is they can get rid of stress by interacting with other people, which seems really kind of strange to people who are not high people oriented. They get stress relief by interaction with others. What stresses them is by having no one to talk to, by being alone. That builds up stress with them. Why? Because they're so people focused. They love interacting with other people. If they don't have that, then then stress builds up. So they can de-stress themselves by interaction with people. Interesting point about talking about putting people in the right place. In other words, the right type and style of people into jobs that fit them well. You can see that if you were to take a high I person and put them in a computer desk job, if you will, where they're working on the computer all day, filling out forms or working by themselves or doing research on the computer, that a high I person, even though they may have the traits and the skills to do that, it would run them crazy. What would happen to you with a high I person in that kind of a position is they would be getting up every 5 or 10 minutes and going to talk to somebody. In other words, they would disrupt the workflow because why? They have that need to. So that's why it's so important to understand how a position, and we'll talk about that a little more later, has a certain behavior style trait that's characteristic of the position, and then putting people who have those traits into that position who also have the talent and the skill. Another one is the emotion. The emotions of a high I are optimism. Again, we talked about that a little bit earlier. They think it's going to happen. They're just optimistic about being able to get the job done. So you have to be, sometimes that over-optimism can create challenges in organizations. But we do need that. We do need optimism because they supply hope, if you will, in some situations. The other one is percentage of population. Again, a pretty steady level of percentages in the D, the I, the S, and C. In terms of the I, about 26% of the population are high I's. One of the studies that was done recently began to indicate that as our population is changing, as our demographics are changing, as generations are having different traits and characteristics, if you will, in our nation, that more and more people are falling into this high I category. So this high I percentage is slowly rising, if you will, in our nation. Well, that's some good information, if you will, for high I's. And I encourage you to write those things down as we've talked about them, go back and refer to them. And as you do that for the D, the I, the S, and the C, then you'll be able to get a better idea of how to identify people just by observing their traits and their characteristics. In our next chapter, we'll talk about the high S.